Ayan na.
What's up, bro? Ano yan?
Oh, nagsimula na. Mukhang nagsimula na talaga ang World Cup na hiyang sa Pilipino ah.
Yan! FIBA World Cup,
Hindi yung
bro!
hindi yung World Cup na hindi hiyang sa Pilipino kasi alam mo ang Pilipino, Richard.
Sige lang, bro.
Dalawang oras siya nasa traffic araw-araw.
Correct.
Hindi sila pwede maghintay ng 2 oras para makakita ng score.
Isang goal
Kailangan
lang.
score parang Jordan Clarkson. Tira lang ng tira, pare.
Right.
Hanggang malapit-lapit ng konti yung final score. It's the Filipino way, bro.
Bro, I mean, come on.
It's
I
around.
hated the game with the Dominican Republic because parang, wait lang, parang katulad to ng football, sobrang dikit. Tie, second quarter, tie, third quarter, tie all the way in middle of fourth quarter. Sabi ko, this is like football except mas, sadomasochist kasi marami kang gagawin, may slash and burn, pero tie pa rin, di ba? So, I said, it's everything that is bad about football minus everything I love about football. But bro, how did you feel about it? Because Dominica is a strong team, no? They beat Argentina.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, actually, hindi ako nanonood ng live party time difference also.
Oh.
Partly because parang I'm really an NBA fan, to be honest. Pero Jordan Clarkson is interesting because
Right.
in the NBA, hindi yan makipagtapatan ng ganyan kay Karl Anthony Towns.
Yeah.
Karl Anthony Towns is an all-star.
Yeah.
Jordan Clarkson is kind of more of a six-man.
Yeah.
He's in that role, parang spark off the bench. Pero when you have him carrying his own team,
Yeah.
parang nagbabago yung stats niya. I remember a couple of years back, somebody called him a discount Russell Westbrook. And actually, he did really look like a kind of, it does really, when he's in the Philippines, he really kind of does look like a Russell Westbrook because Russell Westbrook parang when he's leading a team, that's when he's the best because he has the ball, he's scoring, and that's what Jordan Clarkson is when it comes to the Philippines. Of course, yung Sadon is of course kinakarga lang yung team, and I don't know what people,
Yeah.
how people there feel about us being carried by an NBA player and Filipino American. Of course, a lot of people would probably want more input from the PBA players, but such is life, and such is the beauty of Jordan Clarkson's game. I'm not too fussed
But
about
the
it.
others played decent, no? I mean, whether it's, Ramos had some good 3-point shots. I think Fajardo did much better. I got so much bashing nung question mark lang ako nung lumabas si Fajardo dun sa lineup. I just ask a question kasi parang tanong ko, ano to, Ronaldo, Messi feels na, you know what I'm saying, still going strong, di ba? Medyo pa-veteran na eh. What do you think about the Fajardo one?
Bakit ka naman ito-troll about? Bakit ka naman
Well, I
ito-troll
just
for
put
that?
question mark kasi I didn't even say anything, and immediately people attach the most negative things to it, yung mga Fajardo fans. Sabi na, stick to politics, huwag ka na mag-basketball. It's like, what's that supposed to mean? How does being a political analyst disqualify you?
Okay, pare, lagi naman ginagawa sa iyo yan eh. Every time you talk about something else, sabi you stick to your
Exactly.
lane. Don't talk about Junmar,
Ayan.
but also don't talk about the central bank.
Ayan tayo. Yung central box, sa'yo na yun eh. Ikaw yung binabash doon, bro. No, but going back to this, bro, bago tayo makipagbardagulan na naman. No, I mean, going back to this, how did you feel about the Jot Reyes coaching also? Because he got also a lot of reaction dun sa Kai Soto's kinda our hope, right? For our first NBA guy. I don't know still the status there. You better know than me. Kasi pinaupo na siya after at quarter of 2 kasi parang hindi niya yata matapatan talaga si Carl Anthony, di ba? So, I don't know, how do you feel about Jot Reyes also still in charge?
Kung yung para mo matatapatan si Carl Anthony, talaga ang mamaw naman talaga si Carl Anthony. I think people kind of forget how good the guy is.
Yeah. And he's a
Ito mo sa-
three-pointer.
even-
And he's a
yeah.
three-pointer. Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, grabe yung outside shot niya. He has like a sky high 3-point percentage. He's the ultimate stretch 5 in the game. Medyo mahina yung depensa, but he's like really an offensive weapon. And yung and I mean like his team, the Minnesota Timberwolves, are a solid team, and he's a really quality NBA player. I don't think nakakahiya na hindi mo mag-guard si Anthony Towns, even Carl Anthony Towns. Si Cat. I think other players would have a hard time guarding Cat. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on
Oo, kasing
coaching.
offensive rebounds at saka turnovers, medyo patay tayo dun I think dun
Mm.
talaga that made the difference. But I think we're very much into the game until the first half of the fourth quarter. And then,
Oo nga, 'di ba? So
yeah,
kung
very
gano'n
close,
kalaki,
bro.
it's a good showing. It's a good showing. I mean, the nice thing about Philippine basketball naman is like in a way high stakes but low stakes kasi
Yeah.
parang hindi naman talaga tayo mananalo ng FIBA World Cup, 'di ba? Pero
Yeah.
marami tayong madali tayong maghanap ng silver linings. That's the beauty of watching Philippine basketball. It's about watching silver linings because we'll never be the best, but we love the sport. So, there's a
But we're among
kind
the
of
better teams. We still make it to the
yeah,
World
yeah,
Cup,
yeah.
no?
And
We're
there's
still
there's a
top
kind of
30.
charm to that, 'di ba? Yung parang hindi bulok, hindi sobrang galing, grabe yung passion. Okay na yun. Okay na yun.
Oh,
Kaya ang git nga gusto ko sana, kung nandyan ako, manunod talaga ng
yeah, I
FIBA.
watch it in the mall. Mas masaya talaga when you're together with people and the excitement and the daming kinakabahan, yung mga shopkeepers, ayoko na manood, yung mga ganun, like, oof, and the time, it's almost 10 p.m. na umaabot, so I know it's not the best time for you, but also here, it's kind of towards the end of the night.
Oo
Now,
nga, no?
there was a time, though, that, Lela, we were competing for if not gold, at least bronze, right? And in that context, si Carlos Caloy Loizaga was recently put in the Hall of Fame. And in fact, we had his son-in-law, no less than Jano Gibbs, as one of our recent guests sa Real Talk.
Sana yung
Pinag-usapan
point
na.
si Jano,
Di
si
ba?
Jano.
Yun
Wow.
yung dad
Wow,
ng
okay.
ano niya, asawa niya, di ba? So, Jano Gibbs told us his own personal story, including, when he was still, getting the ball rolling and all the way. So it was a very emotional, sentimental one. And I really appreciate that
Yata pang
conversation.
basketball ang height ni Idol Jano, no?
Bumabawi naman yung si Idol Jano No, but seriously, I mean,
Mabawi sa process.
si
Siyempre
Kaloy
kasama pa rin talaga
Loizaga,
sa
have you,
ano.
I mean, as a historian, have you looked back at those days? I mean, what made the Philippines among top 3, top 4 teams on earth back then? Is it because first movers
Ngayon lang
advantage?
actually this week I've been reading yung
Yeah.
great book ni Lou Anthony Howe, which is the best history of why basketball became famous in the Philippines. How
Ah,
basketball overtook baseball, for
right, right.
example. Yeah, and he says that it was really like an urban sport. But sa tingin ko, kaya magaling yung Pilipino sa basketball early on, kasi meron rin talagang element of nauna ay nauna.
Yeah,
So,
first movers
no,
advantage.
first movers,
Yeah.
una na develop yung game. So that's why we were good then. And I think there is a possibility of being great pa rin again. But that doesn't mean na I was listening to another podcast about Philippine, yung may official NBA podcast about Philippine basketball.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I forget the name. I can get it to you, or you can just Google it. But Philippine NBA, Philippine basketball. It's official NBA.
Right.
And one of the arguments they made there is yung mga matatangkad natin, meaning yung mga whatever, 6'8",
6'10".
ganyan.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
10 ganyan. Paglalaroin mo na yan ng sentro sa Pilipinas or maybe power forward, maybe they play the 4. The problem is, sa NBA, hindi yan pwedeng sentro, hindi yan pwedeng power forward. So what you get is people who are small for the NBA trained with center skills. So the way forward is, I guess, to essentially train them as small forwards. How do you do that in the Philippines when the demand is their center? Is there a center?
Yeah.
Is the a center? So di ko alam. So really, like, we should invest in our guards. And what I found out dun sa show na yun is that the person who made it closest to the NBA, the person who was like invited to an NBA training camp but said no, was actually a point guard, Johnny Abarrientos. Johnny Abarrientos was the closest pala to making it to the NBA.
Yeah,
Di ko
point
alam yun.
guards natin solid, yeah.
Alos ano na, Johnny Abarrientos is small, right? Pero he really dominated the league. Parang there's been no Filipino MVP like Johnny Abarrientos
Yeah.
pala.
And
It's
what
kind of
about the strategy game? Because now Spain is very dominant, and at least since 10, 15 years ago, when you saw nahihirapan na talagang US going against Greece, Spain, this even France at some point, and
Argentina.
definitely
Oo.
Argentina. Many were talking about maybe it's a question of, and at what point even yung mga Yugoslavia, yung mga ganyan type na countries, diba, now, which no longer exists, obviously. The idea was we should approach it in a European way, that this is really a team strategy,
rather than relying on superstar players, which is more the American style. And the argument is the Philippines more American style rather than European style, which spreads the burden, maximizes each of the members. What do you think about that? Essentially, strong link versus weak link strategy, if I could put it in a Malcolm Gladwell way.
Okay. Or what LeBron James says, yung you play the game the right way, and
Right.
by that he really means kind of like even your stars are pass first stars. So
Yeah.
the best example is the current great best player in the world, Nikola Jokic,
Right.
who's a star but who's also a pass first star, and that's why LeBron admires him. So I think like for example, mga Pilipino like they see somebody like Steph Curry. Like I don't know, I don't hindi ako ganun ng streetball ngayon, but I get the sense that because sikat si Steph Curry for the past few years, ang gusto ng mga tao, gusto ng mga Pinoy, they'll play like Steph Curry, so star
Yeah.
titira ng tres, tatakbo titira kagad ng tres.
Yeah.
That I guess that's not the way. That's I don't like that. My favorite player is LeBron James, kind of pass first star.
Yeah.
Hindi pa sikat. But knows how to nail the jumper when needed. So
Yeah.
I don't know. People like Nikola Jokic, people like Luka Doncic. Although medyo heliocentric si Luka Doncic.
See, look at
a different.
Magic. Look at Magic.
Oh, Magic.
Ang
He's
galing
like
niya. He did very well the other day.
he's a great passer, but he does suck the air out of an offense sometimes. He's like heliocentric,
incredible.
but I love Jokic. He's fun to watch.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll develop a kind of Jokic type pass first
Yeah.
superstar.
I mean, they don't have that kind of Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan feels to them, right? They're very sober, very technical. Ang ganda ng timing. They don't even look that athletic. I don't want to make this
Oh.
white boy you can jump joke. And then suddenly they do some crazy moves like in game with Venezuela, I think the other day. Nagsalpakan yung dalawang Venezuela.
Oh.
So sobrang galing na mag-fake. Like, wow, I was so impressed.
But I would say that the GOAT is like that, the greatest player of all time. Not Jordan, but LeBron. The GOAT is pass first and is also athletic. He's everything. So
Yeah.
don't get me started on LeBron.
Yeah.
One of my favorite people in the world.
Right. Speaking of the, I don't know, ghosts, or speaking of like, the glory days of the Philippines, let's go back to this. So now let's transition to our, bread and butter, which is really political history. Let's go to this. So before talking about the Brics, because the Brics recently had expansion, there's so much hype around Brics. All the alt-right guys love Brics. All the alt-left guys love Brics, right? Because it's a kind of a middle finger to so-called liberal Western hegemony, all of that. But before we go into the Brics, right? One big conversation that is popping up is the Brics is being misunderstood as a kind of a new Bandung conference, a kind of a new attempt at creating a more powerful non-aligned movement to really this time dislodge Western hegemony, which has been in charge for the past half a millennia, right? And we're seeing a lot of people, especially from India, coming out very strong and saying, no way is this like another Bandung conference. But
Thank God.
Thank God. And I want us to add to this debate, because speaking of this debate, I think there are two historical individuals in the Philippines which are very relevant to understanding both the Bandung Conference and the more long-term way of understanding also the relevance of Brics and where it can go right and wrong. And both with letter R, Ricarte and Romulo. And again, being you're not Ricardo yet. And to push the envelope, which is what you and I always do, where especially you're more iconoclastic. I'm more controversial, but you're more iconoclastic. I think for me it's more the aggressive, performative one.
That's fair. That's fair.
Right?
That's fair.
Yeah, have you noticed that?
Fair.
I'm not as iconoclastic as you, but I'm more aggressive, so it makes it
So
controversial.
sinasabi mo, kupal tayo pareho. Like in this That's what you're
Yeah.
saying. Okay.
But yours probably is at once more subtle and more deep burn. Right? Like mine, I can get away with it because I'm gonna charm the guy away or whatever and define. Ikaw talaga, hoops talaga eh. Like, go all pero slow burn, diba? Going back to this, Artemio Ricarte, Carlos P. Romulo, two fascinating characters that I feel, especially in our world, academic world, kind of nationalist, leftist world, I think have not been accorded a proper place of pride, right? Or some would say opposite of place of pride. In short, what I'm arguing is that Romulo, I think, and I'm very grateful to your writings, among others, on this, not to mention other writings like, Vijay Prashad's History of Poorer Nations. So essentially, post-colonial historical literature. My sense is Carlos P. Romulo has been underappreciated. Yes, him working for Marcos and a lot of self promotionalism of him. Yes, my side siyang ganun, no question about it. But aside from his prowess as a writer and journalist and his supposed greatness as a general, he was a true champion of the post-colonial world in ways that is not appreciated. And in the same way, if you go to Ricarte, Artemo Ricarte, I wrote a piece. I said first Ricarte syndrome, and I realized like yung head yata ng NBI ngayon, Ricarte rin pangalan. So ginawa kong Ricarte tragedy just in case I don't get into trouble. Baka ma-misunderstand ako. But my sense is Ricarte, there's a Camp Ricarte dito sa, I think, Batangas, Cavite, and then he's seen as kind of the last revolutionary, which I think technically is correct. But many people don't appreciate how he went really off the rails, and I think Nick Joaquin captured that very well, and even Sionel Jose in his book Vibora. So let's talk about this. The Ricarte one for me is essential because
Si Vibora, di ba? No?
yes,
So,
let's
lang naman
go.
yung kwento ni simple lang naman yung kwento ni Vibora, di ba? Sa mga tao na sobrang fan ni Antonio Luna because of that, that pro-Duterte film, Antonio Luna. Effectively pro-Duterte film.
Pre-pro Duterte.
Pre-pro Duterte o proto-pro
Oh,
Duterte.
yeah.
Kaya nila gustong-gusto yun kasi si Luna yung tipong hindi yung sumusuko, di ba? Hindi ako susuko,
Exactly.
isisigaw ko sa mundo, para sa'yo ang labanan. Sorry, I'm quoting Pacquiao. So,
Yeah, you're asking for it. See?
ha?
I told you talaga, Coops talaga. Pero go, bro.
Love ko yung kantang yun.
Love ko rin
Love ko yung
yan.
kantang yun.
Sige.
Lagi mo kinakanta sa karaoke yun. So, gusto nila na hindi sumusuko. Pero si Ricarte talaga, si Ricarte has another one. And hindi talaga siya sumuko. Hindi siya sumuko sa mga Amerikano. Nagpa-exile siya rather than rather than capitulate to the Americans. Eventually, bumalik si Ricarte as a confused old man alongside the invading forces of the Japanese. And he was proud to do that because he felt that he was defeating the American imperialist. So yung sinasabi mong, hindi na ba Ricarte syndrome ngayon?
I just put it tragedy na lang. But yeah, it is in a way, in a sense that because sa tingin ko maraming tao na galit sa EDCA at US ngayon, may pagka-Ricarte element in the sense that they're turning a blind eye to what China is doing in the same way that Ricarte not only turned a blind eye to Imperial Japan's horrific record, already during his time, what they were doing in Manchuria, what they were doing in Korea, I mean, horrible things they were doing, right? Hindi pa kasagsagan ng Second World War. Alam na natin, Imperial Japan was really a horrible, aggressive empire. And he was so fixated on his anti-Western, anti-American kind of ideology that he lost touch with the reality, with the sentiment of his people.
Effectively,
Yeah.
he became a fascist.
And
As a result
makapili,
of-
di ba? Because now marami nagsasabi na may makapili 2.0 na daw tayo among ourselves, right? This kind of Ricarte-like figures who back in the day were strongly against US for very good reasons. I mean, the US was not the best of allies and sometimes more than not the best of allies. The new colonialism was definitely reality for a very long time. But at the same time, you see these people apologizing for China, if not worse. And for me, that brings Ricarte to my mind. Yeah.
Meron talagang through line yan. So, let's look at the historiography around Ricarte. So, there's critical historiography, Nick Joaquin, and then one of our other great historians, si Reynaldo Ileto, is he wrote a positive kind of assessment of
Right.
Ricarte in his book called Filipinos and Their Revolution. Now, it's very interesting what became of Professor Ray Ileto, who became a supporter of Rodrigo Duterte
Yeah.
and a supporter of Rodrigo Duterte's pivot to China policy, yung kind of what I see and what you see as yung katraidoran ni Tatay Digong. So it's not surprising that the greatest historical supporter of Ricarte is kind of now like a supporter of Duterte's pivot to China, and is in fact the kind of historical equivalent. What to political writing Rigoberto Tiglao is, Ray Ileto is to historical writing, right? They
Analogous, yeah.
they essentially share the same position, this kind of pro-Duterte, anti-China, anti-Aquino, and probably now also anti-Marcos dahil nag-pro-US na si Marcos.
You're right. Yeah, and speaking of that, your critique of Ricarte makes perfect sense in light of how you also explain the nuances of people like Romulo. In fact, the more I read about how you explain Romulo, not only in your book but also in your other writings, and the more I also read about Romulo, I kind of understand where you're coming from, where your passions are coming from. Medyo na-gets ko yung algorithm mo, right? And so your argument is Romulo was to Asia what, I don't know, George Orwell and Leon Bloom and the Camus of Europe were, right? Or those resisting Soviet communism, essentially liberal or progressive anti-communism. That's your argument, right? Because Rommel is essentially dismissed as a American lackey, supposedly. Marcos lackey, even worse, right? Probably that's even worse than being an American lackey. So there are all of these ways of dismissing Romulo. Not to mention, as you correctly point out, his intellectual contributions are also not very much appreciated among the social sciences, international studies kind of people, especially in UP, where I come from. But what you're saying is actually that guy, yes, notwithstanding all of his frailties and imperfections and vanities and questionable claims about who said what, right? And whether he met Ho Chi Minh, for instance.
Medyo barbero siya
Yeah,
sometimes.
medyo may kwentong barbero. I mean, your part about him meeting supposedly Ho Chi Minh and the numbers just not making sense, or probably they just forgot the right year. Like natatawa na lang ako dun. It's like, yeah, if he were born in that era, he would have been like a social media star. Like yung alam mo yung nakikipicture sa mga
Of course. Oh.
influencer
Yeah,
talaga right?
also,
He would have
also
done
because maboka siya, mahilig siya magpatawa,
exactly.
medyo maliit siya na may
Yeah,
konting
yeah.
Napoleon
Napoleonic
complex.
complex, yeah.
He was a real charmer. Dahil siya eh. So papasok ka daw sa opisina niya sa UP when he was president, and lahat ng kanyang mga toga from all of his honorary degrees, ganun, nakapalibot
In your
na.
face, di ba?
Tapos papasok ka, and he would crack a lot of like dirty jokes, yung
Yeah.
ganong kind of tito jokes. And so he had this reputation of being a dilettante, and then yung kanyang intellectual contributions laging challenge because ang dami niyang ghostwriters. And we know now
As a
that
fact or as a talagang may ghostwriter siyang marami just because he was
marami
busy
siyang
or like
ghostwriters.
yeah.
So, his ghostwriters were some of the finest intellectuals of the time. Salvador P. Lopez, of course, being the primary ghostwriter, na like a real hero of mine. So medyo ambiguous yung
I know. Medyo morally ambiguous si
Medyo morally ambiguous yung admiration ko for Romulo. Medyo less ambiguous yung admiration ko for Lopez. So, SP Lopez was kind of ghostwriter. Cesar Mahul was a ghostwriter. I think maybe even O.D. Corpus for a bit. So talagang, like luminaries, mga magagaling talaga magsulat. So no wonder, Romulo's intellectual output was so fine because he had ghostwriters. I mean, very similar to this boss Ferdinand Marcos. Kaya ganda ng intellectual output kasi tatalino ng mga people that surrounded him. But I think yung core ideas ni Romulo are his. Even though he had a lot of ghostwriters write those ideas. And yung core idea niya is actually quite simple, which is when we talk about non-alignment, a lot of people, when they talk about non-alignment, and this is both the left and the right, when they look at the Bandung Conference, which is the moment that 1953 in Indonesia, the moment when third worldism as a concept started, at least intellectually. They think about it as, both the left and the right, they think about it as an
55, right?
assault.
1955, yeah.
55, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, 53. They think about it as an assault on the West, in quotes, assault on the West. I find that to be intellectually dishonest because if it's just an assault on the West, why is it non-alignment and why is it a third way?
Yeah.
Dalawa yung inaatake mo. So on the one hand, you are attacking Western imperialism, but you are also attacking Soviet communism.
Yeah.
And that is why it's a third way. That is why it's the third world. That is why it's non-aligned. And Romulo saw it that way. Romulo saw it as a capacious space between the West and communism. And he rightly, and this is very rare, I think, at the time among third world nations, he rightly drew a parallel between imperialism Western imperialism in Asia and Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe. And we know now, di ba, that that
Yeah.
was clearly imperialism. You know what happened in Poland, di ba? So
Yeah.
solidarity,
Or
of course,
Hungary.
is a
Yeah.
movement that in Hungary. Solidarity, of course, in Poland is a movement that exposed that, in fact, that indeed, like,
Yeah.
the Soviet Union was an imperialist power, and of course, as you say, in the 50s, the occupation of Hungary, and Romulo was attuned to this,
Yeah.
and saw the double critique of the West and the Soviet communism as a capacious space. So when we talk about itong Brics ngayon, ang tanong ko lang doon, how can it be an alignment when there does not seem to be a double critique, right? There's not like it would be non-aligned if the position was like neither China nor the US. I think that would be a kind of genuine non-alignment,
Which
right?
is more
If
which is more
assume that the
ASEAN,
world
right? Which
is the
is
US and that in China.
I think ASEAN has a better potential of doing that, although unfortunately many
O nga,
doesn't.
no?
Yeah, I think in theory
Meron,
ASEAN.
meron, meron ka lang hunsen sa ASEAN eh.
Pero meron ka
I
namang
guess meron kang
BBM
hunsen
ngayon.
on the other, ha?
Meron kang BBM to cancel him out. Charot.
Okay, yeah. Pero yun nga eh, sa ASEAN eh. Hindi, actually, yung ASEAN, hindi nga third way because
Yeah.
like, on the one hand, meron kang Hun Sen, unambiguously anti-China,
Yeah.
pro-China, and then meron kang Pilipinas na unambiguously pro-America. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, but we can talk about ASEAN shortly. But let's go back to this. I want to talk a little bit more about Romulo. Can you tell us in what ways was Romulo really underappreciated, especially in terms of championing the cause of what he called the smaller nations? No, of course there was that supposed dialogue with the Russian ambassador to the United Nations when he was the president of General Assembly, but more importantly, even on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he insisted on the rights of Palestinian people, which is very interesting and I think very underappreciated, especially among leftist progressive circles. How he was very critical of U.S. backing very brutal regime, DM regime in southern Vietnam. That was really ahead of time. He was also very attuned to what was happening in the Korean War, where he saw the brutality of both communist China and Russia. So very interesting. I mean, this is a guy who's brilliant journalist. He's keeping up with things. He's very nuanced in his diplomacy. But in terms of his actual advocacies, including in the classified documents, but yung mga kanong galit sa kanya, di ba? Kasi pesky siya eh. He was really doing his own thing. Yeah.
Pesky siya. He could afford to criticize the US dahil malinaw naman yung pro-US record niya. Nobody was going to suspect him of being a communist, di ba? He landed on Leyte with MacArthur. Eh. Paano mo tatawaging anti-US yan? So he used that to his advantage. So he was like capacious in his criticism. For example, nga yung Israel, di ba? America had an unambiguous policy of backing kind of the state of Israel, but Romulo was critical of how it was conceived. I know this is a very sensitive issue, but I'm just going to talk about it from Romulo's perspective. He said that the state had the possibility of becoming a kind of state where you had second-class citizens by the way it was being designed. You know, today, of course, that Arab Israelis are really second-class citizens within that state, and then of course,
At best.
it is effectively now a kind of colonial power in the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
So, he was very critical of how Israel. He wasn't like critical of having a state there. He was very critical of how it was being conceived as a state, and he thought that it was laying the predicate for kind of discrimination, which you really see today. Inoverrule siya ni Magsaysay because Magsaysay got a call from the White House or the State Department and called Romulo and said, Romy, palitan mo. Wala kang magawa. Presidente yun eh. But yung instincts niya was really for colonized people, even the colonized people that the United States was not necessarily supporting at that time. Yeah.
And of course, I think this episode would not be complete if we don't talk about his, I don't know how apocryphal or accurate this is, the exchange with Jawaharlal Nehru, the suave guy of the Bandung Conference, one of the most suave leaders of the 20th century, right?
Nag-away sila ni Nehru noong Bandung Conference kasi binabaran ni Romulo si Zhao Enlai. And alam naman, totoo na binara talaga niya si Zhao Enlai.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a famous quote from Romulo in Bandung. Sabi niya, Zhao Enlai was acting like he read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Kasi Romulo correctly believed that it was a kind of influence operation. Speaking of Chinese influence operations, you can talk about that later.
Yeah.
later on. And he felt like wala pang Sino-Soviet split at that time. He felt like walang karapatan si Zhao Enlai to be there because he wasn't really non-aligned. He was there essentially to soft sell communism to the third world. And along with, I think, other South Asian leaders, talagang Romulo tore into Nehru. And napahiya si Nehru kasi he expected a friendly audience in Bandung. He didn't realize
Yeah.
may Pilipino doon na tatablahin siya. And at that time, Nehru was kind of against what Romulo was doing. But sabi daw ni Romulo, nung matanda na si Nehru, close to his death, at nagkita sila, sabi niya, Romulo, Carlos, or I don't know if he called him
General.
Romy.
General. He
General,
insisted
General,
always
yes,
to be called General
oh,
Romulo, yeah.
and when he was having his own problem with his own Maoists, they have their Maoists also. Sabi niya, Romulo, General, you were right. You were right.
Yeah.
So
And
we don't
this
know if
is
it's
of course the Chinese invasion of
barbero si
this
Romulo.
is the 1962 war, right, of Chinese invasion of India, piercing through the Himalayas. And based on some of the studies I saw, actually China was in a position to march all the way to New Delhi if they wanted. Except
Oh, hindi
yes,
ko alam yun,
it
ah.
was so
Oh.
decisive na had China decided to go all the way to New Delhi and put either a puppet regime, they could have done that. They were really in a position to do that. Remember, there's a Dalai Lama also aspect to this. So that's why this was really painful for Nero, because he was not the same man. He was not regarded in the same way. He was no longer the Jawahir. Jawahir comes from the word the precious stone or diamond in Persian. So was it apocryphal, or was there evidence to show that they actually caught up in New Delhi towards the end of Nero's term?
Hindi ko na matandaan. Actually, medyo matagal ko na nasulat to.
Sorry about that. I'm like bringing ghost of your
Well,
own
no, I
writings.
mean
Yeah.
I just like I have to check my footnotes. I have to check my footnotes, and I'll do that eventually. Pero all I can say is that with Romulo, hindi ka talaga sigurado kung totoo or hindi. Kasi nga, he was a
Medyo
guy who was known
maharlika. Medyo
for
maharlika.
pulling people's legs.
Yeah.
And he loved a good story. I think it's not that Romulo was a compulsive liar. It was just that he wanted to tell the best
His
version of the story.
aesthetics matter to him more than factual accuracy. Let's just put it.
He wanted to tell the
Yeah.
best version.
Parang kumbaga, if you were a writer of if you were a biographer of Trump, he's more like Michael Wolff type, I would say, than let's say, like the Washington Post guys or something like I like Michael Wolff accounts of Trump. It's actually more accurate to me, in terms of capturing the ridiculousness of the Trump administration. Kasi yung ibang biography parang respetable pa nga si Trump. Like, no, I'm not gonna take this guy seriously. He's crazy.
Ang inspiration ko writing that Romulo chapter was yung chapter ni Rizal Mojares on Pedro Paterno, because si Pedro Paterno mas barbero pa yun kaysa kay Romulo. He would
Novelist,
make
yeah.
claims, for example, like meron ng Christianity sa Pilipinas prior to the Spaniards arriving. He would make claims na his
Sanginay,
family
yeah.
ancient nobility, equivalent to the ancient nobility of Europe, ganyan.
Italiano.
May pagka-Italiano vibes. May pagka-Jose
Yeah.
Marco vibes So what I wanted to do was kind of similar na parang amidst the kabarberuhan and amidst the apocryphal
Kabarberuhan.
stuff, merong parang core message that is obscured or that people forget because they're laughing at all this kabarberuhan. And I think yung capacious middle of third worldism, that was the core message of Romulo. And the way he thought about that as inherently Asian, not necessarily as just a product of the U.S. and the Philippines as a possible venue for Asian solidarity. I think that's a great core message that we can keep returning to.
Thank you for that, Lele. I think we should just close the first episode on that. We'll discuss further Brics in a separate episode. Thank you very much, Lele, for joining us. Well, actually, not us. This is together. So thank you very much. Period. Okay.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Now let's go to the next one quickly. All right, Lele. So a while ago we discussed in a previous episode we discussed the Ricarte, Romulo, those kind of historical antecedents, important figures, controversial, colorful, interesting figures, no, pang literary figures, very complex characters in Philippine history. And I mean, before we talk about Brics, no, to be honest, how do you feel when you see like Filipino figures really holding it at the highest levels of discussing the emerging global order, right? In a sense, don't you feel we should have the same thing? I mean, you can kind of see what we're trying to do here, right? We want to be part of this conversation about global South, right? Because I think the Romulo intervention makes you kind of
Ah,
proud of being a Filipino, right? And also Salvador Lopez, of course. Like, kasi usually Philippines is dismissed as kind of a deputy sheriff of U.S. in Southeast Asia, right?
mm,
And I feel your writings really shed light on the fact that no, it's far more complicated than that. And in many ways, we're actually the underappreciated voice of the global South, a very articulate and eloquent one. Napa-proud ka ba? Ako, I mean, again, I'm also morally ambivalent on Romulo compared to Salvador Lopez. I think we stand on the same moral plane here. But I'm also impressed with the intellectual audacity. Not just the depth, but the audacity of sino ka ba? I mean, it's
ah,
like conferences today when the Indians, Singaporeans, Filipinos fight together and may laban talaga mga Filipino academics. I
ah.
mean, you should know that very well, right? What do you feel about it when you were writing about this?
Ayun yung meron nga talagang sense na yung Philippines, kahit gaano kahirap siya, it does produce like top tier
Stellar.
intellectuals.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like, we discovered this early on, I think both of us, because parang yung Pilipinas, its universities are underfunded,
Yeah.
whatever, like mahirap siya na bansa. Pero pag linabas mo, linagay mo sa Asian Debating Championships,
Yeah.
kakainin natin ang boyang Singapore, di ba?
Right,
Kakainin natin
right.
ang boyang Malaysia,
Yeah.
right? Oh, well, they can compete with us, but we're always going to be ahead. We're going to be ahead of them. We're
Yeah.
even better than the Indians in terms of debating. So, and Romulo actually was kind of well known as a debate coach. He
Right.
sent a debate team to the United States, and they won against some of the Ivy League schools there. So,
Right.
meron talagang sense that yung the best Filipino intellectuals, pwede mo talaga itapat sa best intellectuals sa mundo. And you kind of see that, like, lalo na with our DFA in the 50s and 60s with people like Romulo, Ingles, Salvador P. Lopez.
Right.
Diba si Lopez, for example, when he became chair of the Commission on Human Rights, si John Humphrey was one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sabi niya, this Lopez is the greatest chair of the commission we've ever seen, ahead
Exactly.
of even Eleanor Roosevelt. That was in Humphrey's diary. And of
Right.
course, if it's the diary, it's probably a bit more honest than a public statement. So,
Yeah.
meron talagang pride.
Yung nga, Pinoy
Um,
pride. Do you get that thing from this, from when
I
you're
do, I
writing
do, but
this?
sometimes iniisip ko yung class na yan that kind of distinguishes itself. It's also evidence of yung great inequality ng Pilipinas, because like you have a really well supported intellectual class that can thrive because of whatever private
Kind of
money,
Brahmins. Kind of like the Brahmins of the Philippines. Mm.
because of opportunity, but at the same time, that's these are not avenues that are available to everyone else.
Yeah.
And it kind of sucks. And there was a lot of, I feel like there was a lot of probably there's a bit more social mobility in the mid
Mm.
20th century than we have now. And I think we really need to think about, the state of our public schools and yung social mobility. So, one thing I realized, for example, yesterday, I was researching yung childhood ni Gerardo Sicat, one of Marcos's chief technocrats. At pag kinausap mo ngayon si Jerry Sicat, he's the most conyo person around. Akala mo lumaking mayaman
Oo nga,
kasi
no?
he's a man associated with the trappings of power, and he's very urbane, very soft-spoken. Pero ang background pala ni Jerry Sicat is that neither of his parents finished high school. And
Mm.
he went through the public education system all the way until UP. And then yung PhD niya to MIT was like pure grants, Rockefeller grant, Fulbright, walang individual.
Self-made gentleman, if I can put it that way.
Sobrang
Self-made
self-made.
gentleman,
And I
yeah.
had always thought that he was just like his, best friend Cesar Virata, who was actually who belonged
Brahmin.
to the property class. Hindi, So,
Yeah.
so may mga ganyan kang kwento. If
Interesting.
you, I wonder how many of the technocrats in our future will look like, will have a story similar. Whether you like Sikat or not, his story is kind of nice, right? His story of upward mobility is nice. I wonder if other people will have that kind of same biography in the future.
Speaking of inequality, speaking of not sustaining momentum, I mean, that was the problem with Bandung Conference, right? There was the Afro-Asiatic, conferences after that. There was the non-aligned movement, which still exists. It has a secretariat. I think Venezuela was one of the latest chairs of it, which just tells you about where the direction of non-alignment is going.
Wala na, Laos na.
Yeah, Laos na, but what is the fundamental reasons there? I mean, one, obviously you can look at the wars among post-colonial nations: China versus India, India versus Pakistan, Iraq invading Iran, Vietnam versus China. Another one, obviously, you could say that the West also didn't give much of a chance for this to flourish. Remember, in the 1960s, there were discussions about the new international economic order, right? Whereby, commodity exporting countries from Latin America, Middle East, the idea was we're getting more and more leverage in international trade, and then that was immediately reversed, especially with the debt crisis and all of the McNamara and other kinds of interventions that happened. Again, I'm very indebted to Vijay Prasad's book, A History of Poorer Nations, for appreciating this, as much as, of course, yung Lodi natin, si Walden Belli has written also fantastic on this stuff. So the Bandung spirit or promise, Bandung spirit, I think that was the article that Romulo wrote, no? Kind of faded into history, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll offer two other reasons why. Well, una, the end of the Cold War. So
Sure.
yung kind of capacious middle, kasi wala ka ng Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Hindi na neither US nor Russia. So yung intellectual capacity niya to critique both systems, wala na. And then of course, China medyo at the end of the Cold War hindi pa ganun kalakas. In fact, as China emerges and kind of replaces Russia, and as you said, this might be the real Cold War. We don't know, although nagka-crisis yung China ngayon.
Yeah.
Then that actually might be the opportunity to articulate a new Bandung, because if this is the real
Yes.
Cold War.
Yes.
The other thing I'd say, bakit nalaos yung Cold War, yung Bandung, is because as opposed to non-alignment as an important source of solidarity, region became an important source of solidarity.
Yeah.
So you get the emergence of the African Union, for example. You get the emergence of Mercosur in Latin America,
Yeah.
and then of course you get the emergence of ASEAN in Southeast Asia, and then of course on a more broader level, the kind of regionalization that occurs after the Plaza Accord, wherein you have the United States as the guarantor of regionalization in Asia, and Japan as the secondary guarantor of that regionalization in Asia. So yung
Right.
kind of yung middle big brother and big brother setup ng Asia relative to ng Asia Pacific, like,
Yeah.
which you see of course in APEC.
Definitely. I mean, my sense is this is a good way to transition now to the Brics, because before going to the critique of Brics, I mean, first of all, let's talk about the paradoxes and ironies of the Brics. Brics today is very much known and very much in the headlines because of the so-called de-dollarization, challenging Western hegemony. But the concept of Brics came from a Goldman Sachs report. So it's like, how ironic can you get, right? I mean, that's like, for all their anti-dollar Western
Okay.
stuff, it actually came from a Goldman Sachs report by Jim O'Neill, right? Who is still alive and still saying a lot of stuff about Brics. The second thing is, the one financial institution that the BRICS has created, the New Development Bank, which is based in Shanghai, not only doesn't lend that much, it's in desperate need of dollars itself because some of its members, like Russia. So, like, there are a lot of ways to be a little bit like, this is like more like Andrew Tate kind of hype machine that maraming dodginess going on. But the reality is that, Leloy, there is also some prestige to BRICS, right? Because of presence of big developing countries. Kaya nga sabi ko, if G7 were business class, this is at least premium economy in terms of at least symbolism,
Okay.
right? But, right, having said that, I mean, if you look at the expansion of BRICS just the other day, you have 6 new countries coming in, and I absolutely have no idea what was the criteria for that, right? I can see a lot of energy exporting.
Medyo surprising
Yeah.
na alaki, di ba? Kasi meron talagang dilution of power, may dilution of power din ng konti. So we don't know kung ano yung status sila. Is there going to be tiered membership na now, di ba?
Yeah, exactly.
Are their votes going to be smaller than the votes of the original BRICS? So we don't know.
You're right, and I mean, of course, you have Saudi Arabia there, which is a major, oil exporting, energy exporting country. You also have countries
And
like
traditional partner of the United States.
exactly, and then also the same thing with United Arab Emirates, right, which is also very close to the U.S. but also has close relation with China. And then you have a country like Iran, which is very anti-West, at least the regime there, but also a major oil exporting country. For me, the good thing though with the inclusion of those 3 countries is as you know, the three countries are now trying to explore a détente, if not a rapprochement, which, by the way, was brokered by China. So the BRICS could be an institutionalized platform for dialogue because as Filipinos, we don't want these countries at war with each other because we have millions of
Uh,
Pinoys in the Middle East, not to mention
uh,
price of oil and gas. So actually, the more Saudis, Persians, Emiratis talk, it's better for us. So actually, I like the fact that these countries are
yeah,
coming in. And then you have
yeah.
Ethiopia, you have
So in
Egypt.
that,
Yeah.
in that sense, may pattern. Pero Ethiopia is actually, you mentioned Ethiopia. It's weird. It's not a middle power. It's really poor, and it
And
just
it's in
went through.
trouble, right? They have a civil war
Went through a
situation.
civil war. And the reason why they're there is because they're the African country that's closest to China. So merong ano dyan, may mga straightforward power play moves dyan in terms of yung
Yun nga,
membership.
bro, why not Nigeria, right? Which is the biggest economy of
Oo.
Africa. Ang dami
Oo,
Nigerians na
oo.
paisip like, wait, what?
Oo.
And then maraming Kenyans nagpaisip like, wait, what? You know, like, it's like, parang kinalimutan mo Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, biglang nag-jump ka sa, I don't know, Cambodia, Philippines. Parang
No,
ganito yung nangyari.
Kenya would be
Oo.
Kenya would be the real heavy hitter, no? Oh.
So,
Actually, Kenyans parang mga Pilipino din yan eh, di ba? Parang
exactly,
meron din
exactly,
deep
yeah.
tradition of parang intellectuals who distinguish themselves globally eh.
makulit sila. Oh, like, I mean, Barack Obama, right? And of course, runners, fantastic run. Kipchoge, I mean, mga Lodis marathon, mga Kenyans. And Kenyans, you're absolutely right. They're the Eastern Africa superpowers in many ways, economically, intellectually, etc. And then you have Argentina, probably it's the Messi effect, or like Lula saying, let's put our amigos on the other side so there's no trouble. You know what I'm saying?
Medyo
So,
close din ba sa mga Chinese ang Argentina?
I mean, you could probably say all six countries are close to China. So India successfully pushed for Emiratis, UAE. I think the Chinese were on board for Iran and Saudi Arabia, so that you have the two poles of power. The Indians insisted on Emirates, and then Indians successfully insisted against Pakistan being brought in because the Chinese really wanted to bring in Pakistan, but but you can
Sorry.
yan, magulong usapan yan, bro. Magulo yan.
Oo.
Magulo yan. So, there's clearly a power struggle going on between India and China here. I mean, obviously, Brazil and South Africa are closer to the India position, but they're weaker than India in terms of saying no to China. Well, Modi, macho siya eh. He can say no to China, and they actually dun sa pictures, pinahiwalay sila ni Xi Jinping and Modi. Medyo, ano medyo malalim problema. Bawal ang TikTok ngayon sa India. No? I mean, just to give an idea how things are deeply conflictual between the two countries and the two macho guys. And many Indians, Lelo, are making arguments that you and I are about to make, which is BRICS may give you a vibes of post-West, alternative to West, I don't know, de-dollarization hype, whatever, but it's looking more like a China dominated organization at the rate it's going because China is just so much bigger than everyone else. And China,
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the total exports of BRICS, like 90% is manufacturing from China. You know, something like that. Like it's ridiculous. And the rest are more energy exports. And guess who buys their energy? Of Iran, Saudi, Russia, China again. So like, kung India, medyo ilang ka dito eh. Like, what's gonna happen here? So this is what people are not appreciating about the BRICS. Indians are feeling very uncomfortable with where BRICS is going, despite at least getting the Pakistani question right so far and the Emiratis in. So this is where I agree with some of our Indian friends, Raja Mohan, for instance, to flag some of the fantastic writers there. You can read his works also in Foreign Policy magazine. That this is not Bandung. This is looking like, I don't know, like Soviet Union having a second shot as having its own Warsaw Pact or something like that. Or maybe that's an exaggeration. I mean, for me kasi, ganito Lele, just end on this.
Baka walang mangyari.
Ako kasi Lelo, my ideal situation is post-America but not Pax Sinica, right? Essentially a middle power world. That's my ideology. So dun sa mga idiots who are trying to dismiss me as, you know, ng Amerika yan, ganun. Like, get out of here. You guys are either not reading or tamad kayo or, well, mahabang usapan yan. Bayaran siguro yung mga iba dyan. I am for middle powers of this world. So I like that Iran, Saudi Arabia, Emiratis, Indians, I don't know, Brazilians have more say in international affairs because I don't want the Americans and all to be gatekeepers forever. They shouldn't have been to begin with. But at the same time, like this looks like a very China-leaning situation, right? How do you feel about it?
I wanna, parang, I just wanna say na my ideal version is like, yeah, maybe middle powers, but actually like, a lot of democracies
Yes.
participating in a global order.
And
So I would
Indonesia and
still
Turkey
say-
were not in. That's the surprise.
Oh,
Hindi sinamang Indonesia at Turkey.
In that world, I think the US would still play a role, but they would
Yeah.
play a role equivalent to the role, say, of Japan, Germany,
Yeah.
Korea, ganyan. So
Australia, yeah.
Australia, yeah, that kind a kind of world that's kind of run by those democracies
Yeah.
wherein there's no big brother. Hindi big brother in US, but it would
Yeah.
play with those democracies in a kind of collaborative way. And hopefully the Philippines becomes part of that. That's my ideal
Yeah.
world. Kasi takot pa rin, ayoko pa rin talaga sa mga Modis, India, ganyan. Takot pa rin ako sa mga ganyan.
Or MBS, I mean Saudi Arabia.
MDS,
Just to
yeah.
be clear,
Takot
I
pa
when I
rin.
talk about Saudi Arabia, I'm not talking about the regime. I'm just saying, you want the major Muslim country to be.
And while I'm
Yeah.
encouraged by where Brazil is now, you never
Yes.
know. You never know where they'll be in a few years. You know, we
Yeah.
know na
He's
very
our champion in
vulnerable.
Brics, right?
Very
And
vulnerable si
letter B
Pula.
comes first. Yeah. Although I'm wondering, Lelo, sorry, I'm talking over you because alam ko dami mong sinabi sa previous
Oh.
episodes. So I just wanna share
Yeah,
it
okay lang,
because,
okay lang.
because
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
more
yeah.
my area. No, I mean, good luck with the acronym now, right? Like, wag lang
Oh, man.
Brokes or something like that. Or like, ano yung mga acronym ngayon with all of these new letters and countries coming in. But for me, Indonesia not being included is interesting. And in fact, one version I heard is Indonesia backed out because they didn't want to be seen as joining a pro-China kind of world.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
even
nga, no.
Turkey naman, because they're NATO member, mukhang there's some mutual concerns also there. I mean, Russia is at war with NATO.
Kahit recalcitrant
Si
NATO
Erdogan.
member. NATO member pa rin.
Yes. So yun nga, kasi for me, those two perfectly meet all the criteria. They're the two large trillion-dollar economies. They're democracies, or in the case of Turkey, at least semi-democracy, Muslim majority countries, and yet hindi sila sinama. So I think that in itself says a lot about the potentially troubling direction of BRICS and why we should not be overexcited. Nevertheless, premium economy is always better than economy to me. And hopefully one day we can go business class. Yeah.
And you don't need to displace the US dollar as the
Yeah.
global reserve currency. You only
Just
need to
trade,
increase non-dollar trade.
Yeah,
And
exactly, yeah.
for China, that's already a benefit. Lalo na if there's a long game. And if the
Yeah.
long game is, I guess, to displace the dollar as the reserve currency so that you have more flexibility. That takes some time naman talaga eh. And if you look at how the dollar displaced the pound sterling, for example, it took a while actually, and there was a time roughly in the 1910s and 1920s, roughly
Yeah.
when at the time when we were a colony of the US, where sabay siya as a global reserve currency.
Yes,
So
yes.
the way global reserve currencies work is hindi siya yung parang may isang reserve currency and then overnight na displace. Nagsasabayan siya for a while and you can have
Right.
multiple global reserve currencies at the same time. This was just like proven by the work again of my favorite economic historian, Barry Eichengreen. Na
Right.
hindi siya path dependent, tas ganun na overnight.
Yeah,
May
my
moments na-
contingency, my path breaking, drift, my historical drifts. Yeah, thank you so much on that, Leloy. We'll close this episode. We'll have another short episode. Just balikan natin ng Pilipinas. After all, we're Filipino scholars. Let's talk about our man of the hour, BBM. According to some historian, he's a very normal guy. So how normal is normal? and how good is normal? We'll have a separate
Yung-
episode, Leloy. Wag ka muna sumagot. Let's close this episode on this. Thank you very much.
Sige.
Excited. Magpalit lang ako na, just to give you the
Banyo-
different
at saka
feel.
banyo lang ako.
Okay. Sige, one second. Thank you guys. I'll get back. Medyo pag-usapan naman natin si BBM ngayon.